Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Peter McCoy. Peter is the co-founder of Radical Mycology, a grassroots movement that teaches ways to work with mushrooms and other fungi for personal, societal, and ecological health. Peter teaches mushroom cultivation internationally and online at mycologos.world. He's the author of Radical Mycology, a treatise on seeing and working with fungi, and the new book Mycocultural Revolution, changing the world with mushrooms, lichens, and other fungi. Today, we talk about fungi and their relationship to society. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Peter McCoy. Peter, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
So maybe we can begin with how you became interested in mycology in the first place.
Yeah, sure. It's a question I get, of course, pretty often. And my introduction to mycology was sort of by luck. Like most people I've met throughout my life, I'd learned nothing about fungi or mycology from my family or from schools, from the media really, or anything. I wasn't really introduced to them beyond, say, psychedelics, and of course the idea that you shouldn't.
Oh, the audio's cut out. I can edit this out, but it started crackling and then it's gone silent. It's bad now. It was almost like, when sometimes it adaptively filters out background noise. It was almost like that.
Okay, let me see if my Zoom setting maybe is doing something. I can also turn up the mic a little bit. Maybe that'll help, and then I'll just turn off.
Yeah,
it's on the auto suppress, so I'll just turn that down.
That might be it. Yeah. But yeah, I can edit it together. So if you just want to continue from wherever.
Yeah, or I can just start over.
Okay.
Yeah. My introduction to mycology happened when I was a teenager, kind of by luck and chance. Like most people I've met, I was never introduced to fungi through schooling or my family. Nothing really in the media that was positive. But luckily I got introduced to them when my brother suggested I learn to grow edible mushrooms alongside the vegetables I was growing in my family's backyard as a teenager, just as like another hobby. And I knew, again, nothing about them, and I was just super curious kind of instantly because it was something foreign to me. And I was a pretty curious kid, still I'm a pretty curious grown-up kid, and just went to the library, got the books that I could get, which weren't very many, and they were mostly really dedicated to large-scale farming and people that had money and knowledge and engineering skills. So as a teenager, I was just basically trying to figure this out and failed pretty miserably, but that gave me the sort of the bug, the incentive to kind of unwrap this puzzle over the following years. And it also just clued me into the importance of fungi. Their biology is pretty interesting, and that stood out to me. And just the notion that they're important in the environment. At the time, this is about 20 years ago, we didn't know quite as much about them ecologically, so they weren't as respected as they are now. But it was, there was a sense that they were pretty significant, right? Because they're everywhere. And as the years progressed, I always kind of kept them in the back of my mind, or just a sort of, something I was aware of that most people weren't. I came to recognize. And I also came to recognize that I couldn't really talk to most people about mycology because it was so foreign to them. But as I got older and as I started to learn more about the natural world, about the environment, especially like environmental issues, conservation, and then even social issues, things like food scarcity. And as I started to learn more about all these issues, in the back of my mind, I would think, mycology probably relates to these things, especially environmental issues. And I would try to talk to my friends about it, and they really didn't know what I was talking about, even those that were pretty interested in environmental issues. They just didn't know anything about mycology and didn't really see the connection. So it sort of inspired me slowly, and then over the years, after meeting people and having more conversations, especially with people I eventually met that did know about mycology and knew what I was talking about, that there was a lot of room for exploring these intersections. And so this was sort of what kickstarted my interest in sort of spreading the word and getting people interested. And that was, almost 15 years ago. And so since then, things have sort of snowballed and gone in lots of different directions. But that's essentially where things sort of started for me.
Right. And does that take us up to the point where you initiated this radical mycology concept?
Yeah, pretty much. So I was that started right around this time when I was 21. I had been sort of starting getting to volunteer works, different types of social environmental activism stuff, mostly information spreading. I was really interested in independent printing and media and sort of, knowledge is power stuff, but also environmental stuff and a lot of dealing with waste reduction, things like that, and pollution, even early on. And that was on the East Coast. And when I moved to the West Coast, to go to college, started meeting people that saw and understood what I was talking about, these intersections. And there was one person in particular we were talking about, and we were saying that we had all these great ideas and we should put it into some sort of like written document. And I said, yeah, we'll make a little pamphlet and we'll call it Radical Mycology, because this sort of weaves, these sort of fringe notions of mycology with sort of fringy, political philosophy we were pontificating on, with just sort of the idea of pushing mycology, into the world and sort of challenging maybe traditional ways we've thought about these organisms. And so it sort of had a triple entendre or something like that. So that was the origin, and that pamphlet sold actually pretty well for a few years. And that led me and my friends to start to put on a gathering called the Radical Mycology Convergence. And the first one we thought we might get, a few dozen people, and we had several hundred people come. And that was in 2011. And that was, for me, that was really the point when I realized, wow, and there's not only a great interest in this, because up to that point, it had just been me and a couple of friends, and I really didn't think most people cared. And that all was sort of a big wake up call for me, in a sense, in 2011. And so since then, we've done 5 convergences. We do them about every other year. We've had to skip the last one from 2020, but we're planning to do the next one in this year, if all goes well, here in Oregon. And then over the years, doing that work, I started teaching more, kind of talking to lots of people. That led to condensing my knowledge at the time, or a good bit of it, into my book called Radical Mycology. And then now, in the more recent years, I'm expanding greatly upon that and building out a mycology school that's sort of entirely separate entity called mycologos. And that kind of brings us a bit up to the present, I guess, to speed forward.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really glad that you coined this term, because I feel like a lot of people have the experience of starting to kind of go down the rabbit hole of looking into kind of fungi and seeing all these interconnections and different, ways they can serve as inspiration for so many different aspects of human life. And then I feel when I came across your work, I was like, okay, so here's someone who's actually who's had this insight, but has really done the work trying to condense it into a kind of philosophy. Would you be able to kind of just explain a bit more to people, like this way of seeing the world that you're offering with Radical Mycology?
I could try. It's kind of constantly evolving, even from me. And I've always said from the beginning, from the first convergence, that in as much as I might, or, the other organizers of the event or the other teachers of the event might bring their own perspective, what's so fascinating about where we are at in the history of ethnomycology, this sort of new era of humans connecting / reconnecting with the mycological organisms of the world and all that they offer, is that we all have space to contribute to sort of this new mycoculture, as I like to call it, and this new form of relationship. So in as much as I have my own perspective, I only personally see them as hopefully just a starting point or point of inspiration for some people, who then will take it in their own direction, as many people in just recent years really started to do, especially some artists and things. For me, things really started when I was in my early 20s with, as you might have sort of just been alluding to, the immediate notion, the immediate sort of intro, I think, metaphor you can find between humans and fungi, that mycelium is this nettedness and it's connected, and it's because of the connectedness and sort of the decentralization that it's successful and resilient in nature, and at the same time benefits nature. And so for listeners that aren't familiar, mycelium is kind of like the roots of mushrooms. It's physiologically different, but it looks somewhat similar, and it's in the soils for soil dwelling organisms, and it's branching and absorbing nutrients and traveling and moving nutrients around, doing lots of stuff. But the metaphor for humans is that we can think of us, our societies, our cultures, as a sort of nettedness of information, of human exchange, of dynamics. And that if we only were more sort of non-hierarchical, we might be more resilient. And this comes from, books written on just the notion of broadly resiliency, throughout nature, throughout human history. And we usually find when information is decentralized, when everything doesn't balance on individual pressure points, there's a lot more room for bouncing back. And it's just a good design concept broadly. So why don't we implement that into society and sort of the way that we exchange resources, information. That's where I started. And so like in the Radical Mycology pamphlet, there's a little blurby thing talking about that, little manifesto-y type of thing. But in the many years since, that starting point really has expanded greatly for me. So on the sort of maybe philosophical end, sort of the metaphor end, which is always fun to spend lots of time in, I've taken that intro point or that sort of concept, which still holds true, but for me, expanded upon it to think about, well, the entire culture of the mycelium is actually made up of individuals. And actually how mycelium works biologically is that each individual thread in that network has a terminal and a hyphal tip is what we call it. And that's where all the magic and business happens in mycology. Really, a lot of stuff we value for fungi in the environment is happening right at all these hyphal tips. And at each of those individual tips, there's a little organism that's unique to fungi called a Spitzenkorper. It's kind of strange biologically, but you can think of it kind of like the brain of that tip, and it's assessing the environment, responding to it, building the tip as it grows, doing lots of things, and really engaging with the environment. And each little tip, theoretically, is doing its own unique thing. It's this one over here is sort of defending against a bacteria that wants to attack it. This one's digesting a piece of wood. And so though they are all connected into one greater meta culture, the individuals have like individual autonomy and individual influence on the world. And so, in my younger years, it was kind of, I took the idea of like, oh, we're just in one group and let's just kind of all amorphously, share everything in this mycelium. And that's nice. But really, when you get down to brass tacks, like everybody has to take, accountability for themselves and responsibility and really recognize we all have individual engagement with the world. But at the same time, we are tied to our greater culture. We know no hypha is an island, no human is an island. We are affected by our ancestry, everything we're tied to, all the people around us. And then, but we're also engaging with the environment, and we are directly affecting it every moment, every day in our own little piece of the world. And so there's a really clear metaphor there. And if we want to take it as, fungi as teachers, because they're so ancient and successful and they're doing these things as well, how can we mirror that to some degree and learn from it? And that's somewhat that goes into the book and sort of spread throughout the book. Is just, here's what mycelium's doing in this sort of context, and here's how we apply it to this, maybe abstractly apply it to this concept as a learning lesson, teaching tool. So that's a good bit of, I think, radical mycology in my mind, is that way of thinking. But then there's this whole other aspect of just the practical and the applied mycology, which is what other people might just call it, is taking the research end of things, what is commonly just called traditional mycology. So all the academic work, naming species, classifying them, organizing them. And then, that's where a lot of mycology is still academically, is just figuring out what's out there, what species are out there, and how do we name them. But also for medicinal value, health benefits. And now increasing more days, a great example is the remediation, breaking down toxins, taking waste and creating, viable products out of waste streams via the mycelium growing on it and sort of binding it together, sort of like a glue, but different. So that's a whole new application, a whole new industry of mycology. And there's other things people looking at, the notion of creating fake leathers or faux leathers, and that's actually quite successful. Some companies are quite good at that in more recent years. And so we're, the way to think about that and looking at that trend and recognizing that as building material, as just a kind of physical material, mycelium is, incredibly new, and it actually has a lot of unique properties. And then there's all the benefits of cultivation alone, just for food. You're reducing waste. Depending where you are in the world, you could be taking a major waste stream from local agricultural producers, plant producers who have some sort of waste stream they can't feed to animals or don't have the time to compost, grow mushrooms on that, get a whole new crop, reduce, pollution, waste in that way, maybe carbon output by burning that waste in the field, while of course increasing the food supply in your community and maybe helping with some health issues. So mushrooms are really good for certain health issues. So you have all these multiple functions coming out of this, like one technique, this one science, really touching on many aspects, even getting into the cultural aspects of, creativity, Nowadays, there's more artists creating things related to fungi. And we find historically that there's a lot of influence on fungi and mythologies and things if we want to get into that arena. So for me, this is like kind of all radical mycology. It's just, maybe you, just like me, just like probably a lot of the listeners, grew up not ever hearing about them and not really thinking they matter. And so to me, it's sort of radical, if you want to use that word, to challenge even just that notion that they don't matter. And it's like, boom, here's a million ways that they matter. Let's revisit that. Let's bring fungi more central to our discussions when it matters, when it makes sense, as an important aspect of the natural world, as an important aspect of human history, and probably a really important aspect of the future of humanity. Shouldn't we be talking about that more and celebrating it, getting excited about it, and just getting rid of these old taboos that don't make any sense and their origin isn't even clear? Where did we inherit this idea that fungi are gross and bad and don't even look at them?
Yeah, do you have a sense of where that kind of fungal phobia that we find in a lot of different places, especially in the West, do you have a sense of where that originated?
Well, no, yeah, I was just mentioning there is no clear origin point. We might suspect that in the 1800s, this is something I read somewhere along the way, that the sort of cultural conditions, especially in the UK at the time, and just trying to, celebrate the sciences and do away with dirtiness and create more order and tidiness and whatnot, that led to sort of a distancing from anything having to do with soil and nature and sort of decomposition and things like this. This was very not respectable, I guess, at the time, and that's where it's thought to have sort of originated, and continued on and basically persisted. It's a bit tricky because you can say that, but then not very far away in Eastern Europe, especially, but also France and Italy, there's still longstanding and generations deep cultures and traditions of collecting wild mushrooms and truffles. And so there has been a familiarity in much of Western Europe, and as you go further east, even more so. So it's a little bit hard to say, why did Britain or something just really not get into it when a lot of the rest of the continent was getting into it, but that kind of seems to be the case. We might also point out or argue that just mycology as a science is incredibly young. It's one of the youngest natural sciences. It really only got kind of codified from traditional hunter-gatherer and traditional just preparations and recipes and things like that. It became a more formalized science only about 200 years ago, and that was really just a handful of people over the last 200 years, a couple dozen, really standout mycologists that done the lion's share of work to name and organize and continue to sort out the species that only pop up every so often, and mostly just the mushrooms, and they're just looking at the mushrooms and trying to figure out what these things are. They're not even getting much benefit out of eating any of them. So it's just humans that have to be curious, to do a lot of this work. And probably most people around them thought they were weird and told them not to do it. And so that was probably a grueling process for a couple hundred years. And even through the early part of the 20th century, mushrooms were still classified as simple plants. Like, we didn't recognize them as different. And most the fungi that live inside of plants, which there are many of, weren't even recognized. Many of the soil fungi couldn't even study them, and they're incredibly important. So it was just this really slow crawl to have mycology evolve, and it's only been in recent decades with technology. And then you might add on just the complementing of the internet and information awareness that has helped it really explode. So it's that combination that's really led us to this great place we're in today, or it's really helped pave the way and make it easy. And then you step back and you're like, wait, why haven't we been here before? How come it's taken so long? And it's just that the nature of the beast, I guess, and just the nature of these more mysterious organisms that aren't as obvious or easy to track and see as plants or birds or insects. So that's kind of the best we can say, but there is no clear document, written in 1862 saying fungi shall be spoken of no more or something.
Yeah. I mean, my instinct, I think, is similar, to yours. You mentioned orderliness, and it seems to me like a general trend or an imbalance, you could say, from many cultures have this almost like Taoist yin yang wisdom of the balance and necessity of both order and disorder and the kind of circularity of life, right? And then it seems to me that in the last few hundred years, especially the kind of places like the UK, that you get this imbalance towards order, this kind of wanting things to be a certain way, and then that leads to, rather than complexity like we see in nature, you get kind of complicatedness. Our culture is complicated, I would say, rather than complex, because it's fragile, and we see civilizations collapse in a way that fungi don't. Right? They've stuck around for a very long time evolutionarily, so we shouldn't be surprised that then we can learn from the way that they exist, right? In this networked way, in this way where there are no kind of central nodes that are the crucial part, that if you knock that out, the whole organism dies. You have this distributed resilience. The same thing we see in nervous systems, that you have kind of networks where, if you damage it, other parts can kind of compensate. I think this is using mushrooms as a way into, they seem like a portal really to all these different, hugely important aspects of human society, and potentially unveiling what's gone on in the kind of cultural mind, I think, that has led us down a destructive path when it comes to our relationship with nature. I think meditating on our relationship with fungi is a really wonderful way to bring up these questions, right, and see what the issues are that we're not examining.
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of my personally favorite parts of my book, the one of the sections I was the most proud of, was one of the last ones I wrote on mycophobia and the question of where does this fear of fungi come from, and what does it imply about society, and what has it done to the cultural mind and the individual mind when we've been taught to fear this massive part of the natural world and just completely avoid it, don't even look at it, don't even think about it, talk about it. What does that do to us when we are animals of nature and so tied to our environment? And so there's quite a number of questions that come up for me, and why it can't just be as simple as, some cultures learned that some mushrooms are poisonous and thus they avoided all of them. I mean, there's more deadly poisonous plants in the world than there are deadly poisonous mushrooms. And, traditional cultures were masters of their environment. They, typically speaking, knew pretty much everything around them. And there's certain mushrooms that are reliable, predictable, pop up in the same place every year, very easy to identify, very distinct, taste great. And yet some cultures came to avoid them when others didn't. And so it's just a question of, why is that? Which I don't have a great answer to, but it's one to look into, maybe it depends on the culture and really understanding their history and sort of cosmovision. But more generally, bring it forward to today. One of the books I referenced and sort of was inspired by writing that section is this book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, which talks about how when you look at the history of many great civilizations, when they introduced written language, there was a major shift. And he sort of talks about it went from a sort of matriarchal, goddess-oriented tradition, he gives a great number of examples, to a more masculine, dominated sort of linear approach to world, straight and narrow versus round and wide. And it talks about that as we sort of we get less symbolic and we become more sort of linear and rational, we become more distant as well from nature, and we become to dominate nature and want to control it and have straight lines. And the wildness of nature it conflicts with that inherently. And so when you're trying to propose a whole new way of being that is in many ways unnatural, you have to avoid and discount what is natural, even if it's right in front of your eyes. And so fungi are, in my mind, sort of the greatest example of the wildness and unpredictability of nature. They're hidden. They're in the shadows. They mysteriously appear with no seed. Many cultures attributed them to the lightning, or to moon connections and things like the moon goddesses. And then they come up, they die, their underground network, can't really be traced, and they don't pop up in the same place every year like a bush is always there with berries every season or every spring or whatnot. So, you can think about that. There's many other ways to think about fungi as being wild and unpredictable. So was this something that was sort of, whether conscious or unconscious, sort of again, that sort of pinnacle of the untamableness of nature? And as we sort of distanced away from all of that, not only did we have the effects in society of losing our ecological, relationships, and there's a whole realm of psychology known as ecopsychology, talking about the importance of nature therapy and things for soothing all kinds of emotional disorders nowadays. So what is the impact of removing fungi even more broadly, especially when we individually form these relationships with fungi? Just as yourself, you get inspired by learning about it. They're so interesting, so unique, but also have all these sort of learning lessons maybe woven into their biology. Other people just are drawn to them, just as some are drawn to plants or animals as their life passion. If we've totally cut out that possibility for at least the last few hundred years, what have we missed out on? Sort of psychologically, as cultural development, individual development. It's hard to guess. And then on the flip side, what does that look like to regain that connection? And that's what we're doing right now, individually, culturally, in all these different ways we've sort of touched on. And that's what's exciting to me is going forward, just as we, not that fungi are the ultimate solution to anything, or, but they are a great tool in our toolbox for society, for inspiration, for art and culture. And as we just sort of get over all these taboos, it becomes standard discourse, if you will, just as commonly discussed as vegetable gardening or something, perhaps, or other aspects of nature. What's that going to look like? And I don't know. I mean, that's the exciting thing about this right now, and that's what we said at the first convergence, and that's what I personally try to do through pretty much most all of my work is lower the learning curve, lower the barriers to entry that were there for me growing up. So that the next generation and anybody getting into this can slide right in and have a great time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it feels like we're facing kind of two perhaps barriers when it comes to learning from fungi, because I mean, you're advocating for us learning from nature, right, rather than just extracting it from it. And we already have this kind of cultural norm where we see nature as this kind of inert, stupid stuff that we can has no real moral status, that we can just plunder and extract from. And then within that, you have within nature, you have fungi, which have all these associations that we've already mentioned of decay and decomposition and disorder, and this stuff that we want to kind of look away from in the mainstream culture. So it seems like it's a tall order, I guess, for we're turning around the cultural tanker to actually achieve this. Seems like this is why it's powerful. I think is we're really you're pointing to the core psychological issues in the culture. I think if we can succeed in creating a culture that celebrates fungi, I think we will have had to change really fundamental things in the cultural mind to make that happen. Is that your sense as well?
I mean, I think it dovetails with a lot of other changes that need to occur. I would never want to say, like, as I sort of just said, I've never been one to say that, fungi are going to solve all of our things. If only we did this one thing with fungi, then that's the answer to do it all. But it's a great piece of, kind of a lot of puzzles we're trying to solve and looking towards the future, and things are not going in good trajectories, left and right. And we got to change course and get back on something that's more sustainable. And I think a big part of that absolutely is redefining and redeveloping our relationship with nature individually and culturally. And that really starts on the individual level, kind of going back to the first thing I was talking about with those HIFL tips and the individual's experience. Like, again, for me personally, my own personal development as a human, it's been a lot of my growth is learning the importance of my individual actions and my relationship with nature. And it's only through doing that in my own way, honestly, can I then, share that with others, hopefully inspire others. And you can say about anything in the culture, if we're all doing, our part, whatever that looks like for us, and to a certain degree, we can only we know ourselves the best or whatever. If we're all following our authenticity a bit more, and I think a big part of being authentic is recognizing how much you might appreciate nature, if not want to roll in the dirt or whatever that looks like for you, but care about nature. And we embody that more and advocate for the world around us. then society as a whole kind of comes together around that. And that's in that arena. There's lots of other things we could, of course, be coming together around better. Um, if only individuals, sort of started first or recognizing what's going on with them. But yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing about, for me with, excuse me, with mycology, and what I've seen in other people over the, decade plus of teaching is that it can be sort of like a gateway. It's like a gateway mind opening science. So it's not the drug part of it. It's more that you get into this thing and you realize, as I did, it's like I was told my whole life this thing is horrible or bad or just don't even look at it. It's actually 180 degrees of that. It's amazing. It's wonderful. It's so beneficial. Just make it so practical. Maybe I was told other things that didn't actually line up with reality, or maybe didn't serve my best interest. Maybe I need to start revisiting a lot of my paradigms or a lot of my unquestioned beliefs. Even if they came from people I highly respected, maybe they were misinformed. Maybe it was from my parents and maybe they were misinformed. So it's sort of opens your eyes up in lots of good ways, on lots of levels. And a big part of that is the environmental one, and seeing how essential they are to the natural world. And then through that, how important the natural world is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the idea of them being absolutely essential, I think we should stop on that for a second, because you mentioned earlier how mainstream culture suggests that they're kind of irrelevant and not interesting and just don't even bother engaging with them. But yeah, it seems to be completely the opposite, right? Like the story of life on Earth and our existence seems to be entirely dependent on fungal life.
Well, absolutely. When you look at the chronology of evolutionary theory, we descend from fungi. So, you can just start there. When I sort of really realized that, but what all the research points towards is kind of profound in its own way. The notion being that life evolved somehow, some way as bacteria. Eventually, something had to evolve with a larger cell to eat all the dead bacteria that had piled up for a billion years. And that first organism was something like a fungus, if not what we now call a fungus. And that's a prevailing thought. And from that larger celled, more complex organism, plants evolved, animals evolved. So we come from fungi. Along the way, those organisms and all the relationships fungi were forming, especially with plants early on, sculpted the environment, built up the first soils of Earth. The early Earth, we believe, was just barren rock. It was ocean and rock. And we had to, biology had to die off to build up the topsoil. The rock had to be eroded by not only natural forces, but also through early lichens, is the thought, and the acids produced by the fungal component breaking down, weathering the rock in their own way, decaying organic matter, building up soils, leading the way to larger, more complex plants, eventually whole environments and different ecologies, ecosystems, and then everything's revolving around. We talk in some design philosophies. They talk about how, like, the tree is the center of the sort of ecosystem, or you can think of the tree as sort of the hub, because you have the shelter it provides, you have the understory beneath it that it needs that shade, you have all the animals and insects that are incorporating above and below ground with the tree. And that's all very true. And it's a really good model for thinking about sort of as a microcosm of an ecological web, just a single tree and everything related to it. But what's underneath that tree, what's really providing its foundation, are the microorganisms and to a significant degree, the fungi that are on those roots, in those roots, really throughout the entire plant. Its entirety is filled with fungi inside of it. And those fungi and other organisms, but fungi in their own unique ways, are really providing the nutrients and cycling and moving the nutrients. That's really what sustains life. So, which one is it's not exactly apples and oranges. It's kind of just, which one is more important. You can't kind of have one without the other, but really fungi came first. So maybe, we could have a world that's just all fungi to a significant degree, or predominantly fungi, more fungally dominated than we see now. But they, through their evolution and because their biology have to be hidden, essentially they don't have skin and things like that. They desiccate really easily. So they stayed inside moist environments, stay protected, and maybe aren't as showy as plants. And so we've just ignored them. But they're doing so much. Really, when you boil it down, for anybody new to fungal ecology, the two main takeaways is they do incredible chemical transformation, nutrient transformation, decoupling bonds, creating new molecules that are essential to life, and in ways that no other organisms do. Quite essential on that front, which is a massive topic. And then they move those nutrients in ways that no other organisms can in the soil. So bacteria and other microbes do a lot of important stuff in the soil food web, changing nutrients around through their, especially through their sort of their feces or their waste, and then something else eats that waste, and that's a lot of the cycling. Fungi do that as well, and take in the waste and create waste, and it feeds other organisms. But unlike these other organisms, fungal mycelial networks can span hectares, and nutrients are shunted from one end of that network to the other to feed the plant that needs it. And it's in a coordinated way that, is seemingly a form of intelligence, and it's really sculpting the environment. And in many ways, essentially selecting which plants do and do not survive. And it's not just me saying that. There's mycologists and ecologists that have made this argument, and it's in papers and things like that. Even though it sounds a little bit maybe off the wall the first time you hear it. The first time I heard it, it's like, wow, that's so profound. But fungi are really sculpting the natural world in that way. They're choosing through their actions, essentially, which plants do and do not survive. Ultimately, which insects are then able to eat those plants, which herbivores and carnivores are able to survive, and shaping the whole environment. There's one category of fungi that has about 300 organisms in it, 300 species, called the Glomeromycota. They only live in the soil. They don't produce mushrooms. You never see them, but they're arguably the most ecologically significant of all fungi, because they do all this nutrient movement between all kinds of plants. They'll connect dozens of plant species together in one shared network, moving nutrients between all these species. So it's not just like a one-on-one thing. It's quite dynamic, quite complex. But then they're also releasing other compounds that build the structure of the soil, which is really important for water movement, airflow, for other organisms. So just structurally, it's really significant for the soil. And they also release a lot of phosphorus. This is quite important. They're able to take a lot of phosphorus out of rock, and that's a significant nutrient for an element for plants and other organisms. And they do a lot of releasing phosphorus and moving that around. Those are just three of their primary functions, but they do actually quite a number of other things. And again, you never see them. The mycologists of 100 years ago never knew of them. Or maybe they saw their spores sifting through the soil, but weren't able to track all this stuff that we just figured out in recent years. And that's just one. I mean, I can continue to go on. Those are some of my favorite fungi. Those ones in particular, for lots of reasons, but their ecological significance and the fact that we just never hear about them, don't even know about them, sort of highlights a lot of these points I'm trying to convey.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this connectivity role of shuttling around nutrients seems to, I mean, more than any other animal, we all exist in ecological systems and through each other, but it seems really that fungi are the embodiment of the ecology almost, right? Like they exist in between these different organisms, and these organisms couldn't exist without them, right? Like we're kind of taught that plants in their roots tend to kind of take care of everything they need, getting all the nutrients and stuff. But I mean, would it even be possible for plants to exist without fungi?
Well, probably, some really barren landscape type of environments, or really extreme weeds that can survive on very limited nutrients. I think of plant roots as porous anchors and beacons. So their roots themselves don't do the chemical transformation to acquire their nutrients. If there's a phosphorus rich rock right next to that plant, and there's no organism to help solubilize that phosphorus, it's never going to get its phosphorus. Maybe the little bit will leach out through natural like weathering or something, but it's not doing the chemical transformations. What plants do is they release different compounds like proteins and sugars and carbons, in carbohydrates rather, to attract the organisms that do that chemical transformation. So again, there's bacteria that do quite a lot. There's lots to say about that. But thinking about the fungi, they're also doing this work to attract their root associating fungal partners, the mycorrhizal fungi we call them, and other types of fungi, to bring them their nutrients. And the exchange is the plant is feeding the fungus these carbohydrates and proteins and other goodies in exchange for all the stuff the fungi bring in that the plant would never be able to access and critically needs. So, phosphorus, nitrogen, all kinds of trace minerals, lots of water. The mycelium itself has incredibly high surface area relative to even the thinnest plant root. and it's able to extend out much further, grow much quicker than plant roots, and cover so much more surface area, and through that absorb more water, and then again absorb all these nutrients as it's traveling and doing this chemical transformation work. And a lot of that goes back to feed its plant partner. And this is what plants have evolved to depend on. The oldest plant fossil has fungi living inside of it. These are called endophytic fungi. And then the oldest plant fossil, which is about, I figure exactly around 540 million years ago or so. And then the oldest plant fossil with roots has mycorrhizal fungi associating on it that look structurally similar and quite similar to some of the Glomeromycota species that we find today, which were the ones I was talking about just a little bit ago, implying that that relationship is so successful, and the design of the fungus in these fungi is so successful, it hasn't really need to change. And that one's about 450 million years old. There's even something I heard more recently, that there's a notion that as plants were transitioning and starting to develop roots, that before they actually had true roots, but they were sort of growing on the surface of the soil. I'm not really sure and I'm not even sure how sure they are what the structures looked like. Then there's potentially a transition period where like mycelium was really strongly more tied and really functionally acting like the roots. Whereas nowadays with mycorrhizae, there's sort of the merging of the two, becomes kind of like a barter exchange and sort of a balancing act where there's a clear distinction between the two organisms. But that's just one aspect of the fungal importance. And when we get rid of those fungi on roots, we start to get root rot. We start to get problems with the plant. We start to need to pour water-soluble nutrients right on the root zone so that they can just sponge it up, which is what they're doing when the fungi and bacteria provide it. It's in a water-soluble form. The plant just sponges it up like a porous anchor. When they're not having those friends do that for them because we've tilled and destroyed the soil, we need to pour that stuff on there. But now the root is completely exposed. It has no protection because these fungi and other organisms help protect the plant roots and shield it physically and through chemical barriers. And then they don't have that protection. So what happens? Mother Nature comes in, says this is not right. We need to wipe this out. Other fungi come in to try to kill off these unhealthy things. And then we call fungi bad because they're trying to purge and cleanse the unhealthy system. And we're constantly fighting them with now fungicides along with the other chemicals. And so everything's just out of balance, right? And so bringing in, there's a lot of discussion around no-till farming. One of the aspects there, don't mess with the soil. Let the organisms do their thing, build up your soil food web, bring in organic matter and mirror what's happening in a healthy aged forest where there's super rich community of organisms living in the soil, moving the nutrients, and it'll go on like that forever because that's how it functions. So that's one of the biggest areas of research on fungal ecology, or the mycorrhizal fungi, and there's several categories there. One other group I'll mention that we know less about, but clearly are incredibly significant to plant health, are the endophytic fungi that live inside of plants. And we believe essentially through all plant tissues of all plants, there are fungi living internally, performing any number of functions we might propose or could imagine is plausibly happening. There's not nearly as much research as on the root associating species, but what we do find is some of these fungi provide drought tolerance, extreme heat tolerance, protection against insects that want to eat the plant. They release compounds, or they sort of make the insects not want to eat the plant anymore, along with sort of seemingly supporting the plant's health and maybe creating some of the compounds that benefit the plant, or some of the compounds that benefit us when we eat that plant are generated directly by the fungi living in the plant or in association with the plant's own processes, contribute to the metabolism or the production of secondary compounds. So when we can't even imagine extracting all these fungi out of the plant, but if we were to, very likely the plant would have, an incredibly poor immune system, if you will, and not survive very long.
Right. I think that's an amazing point that, the kind of fungal issues that we see in farming could be the result of us trying to take this reductionist monoculture simplifying approach where we eradicate everything that's going on in the kind of the complex ecology of the soil, and then it's Mother Nature basically trying to say this isn't working. Let's break all this down and get it back into the soil so we can get a kind of start something new going. I think that's really really profound insight. And so if we turn to the kind of ways humans can engage with fungi, is it fair to say that, I mean, humans, a lot of our behavior is based in movement and is very visible, but it seems to me that a lot of fungal behavior is chemical. Is that a kind of a reason why they have so many different applications?
But a lot of the importance in say applied mycology nowadays, industrialized mycology, if you want to box it into that as well, looks at the chemical mastery of fungi, fungal organisms. They do things again that plants, animals, bacteria never evolved to do because they didn't need to do. They didn't need to learn how to do it because fungi were already doing it so well because they came so early on and were already sculpting the world through their digestive ability, their means to especially disassemble, but also assemble really complex molecules. We've taken advantage of that as humans for decades, over a century, by harvesting some of these exudates, these secondary compounds of certain fungi. One of the most famous is, of course, ethanol, the thing that we fuel cars with and also fuel our parties with. And that's a fungal exudate that we've learned to capture for millennia. And it's had a huge impact on human society. There's even speculation that nomadic civilizations decided to settle long ago to grow grain crops consistently to produce beer and bread, both of which were produced by fungal yeasts. And arguably, the beer was more important, not just for inebriation, but also it was considered a really nutrient-rich drink, and kids would drink it and things like this in some ancient cultures. So, but also, of course, you had the levity that came with it, and a lot of reverence, a lot of ritual around it too in some cultures. More recently, citric acid is one of them, really toe-to-toe with ethanol for sort of industrialized fungal compound harvesting, and that's used in detergents. It's used in many different industries, baking industry, of course, food production industries, soft drinks that have citric acid. This is all produced by mold fungi that produce it naturally, or rather have been genetically modified at this point to mass produce and just pump it out into large vats of nutrient broth. And then the scientists go through really a couple simple steps that are basically the same process that's been around for 100 years to crystallize, precipitate the citric acid out of that solution, and then, clean it off and then ship it around the world. So that's actually a really big part of our modern life. There's many other fungal exudates that are captured in a similar way for the medical industry, for things like different nutrients and sort of vitamins to fatty acids to some pharmaceuticals. So there's quite a lot there that we've actually been utilizing fungi for in that way for decades, and just most people never hear about this. So that is quite significant. Actually, a big part of industry, sort of global industries, are heavily dependent on fungal enzymes and fungal compounds and acids inherently. More recently, though, it's the fungal, the qualities of mycelium that are, I guess, one of the newest things we've come to appreciate. Their medicinal value also comes from their sort of chemical mastery, these unique compounds they produce that affect our nervous system, our regulatory systems, our circulatory systems, immune functioning. Those compounds have been revered for, again, millennia in various parts of the world. More recently, peer-reviewed science has sort of backed some of that up. Popularity has also just sort of increased, anecdotes that also increase popularity, and that becomes circular. But we also have, and then also the cultivation of just edible mushrooms and the nutrient benefits they provide comes again through some of their sort of chemical uniqueness and the compounds they produce as they digest food, how they make it bioavailable, and in their fruit bodies, their mushrooms are protein rich, for example, and things like this in ways that compare with certain types of meats. So there's a lot there that again kind of folds into the chemistry, if you will, and the uniqueness of fungi in that way. And we've respected and known about for, depending how you look at it, 100 years, 1,000 years. Again, one of the most recent things, though, I think that's proposing, new trajectories for different industries is the qualities, the physical qualities of mycelium and the characteristics of mycelium itself, not for consumption, but for physical product application. And so that, again, that goes back to this leather that's been, basically refined to a high quality, sort of a really luxurious quality in a couple recent years by a company called MycoWorks in San Francisco. But there's lots of people around the world, lots of companies that have been looking at for a number of years about making physical products. So, one company started making styrofoam replacement, but now it's getting into all things of, looking at replacing the tabletops and some days maybe the paneling in our houses. Really anything that's solid and rigid to some degree could be made out of mycelium someday. Even helmets and things like that, it's been proposed because it's highly impact resistant. Mycelium structurally can actually take a force, a direct force and a blow and distribute it through its net better than concrete, say, that doesn't have that nettedness without rebar. So there's lots of examples there, and potentials that have been proposed from an engineering standpoint. A parallel that I've heard is, essentially when they discovered oil-based, petroleum-based plastics, 100 years ago, that just revolutionized so many industries. It just revolutionized the world. And people speculate that mycelium might have a similar, maybe not quite as a profound, but a similar effect on many, many industries as we refine the practices to grow them quicker using all kinds of wastes. So historically, we've grown mushrooms on agricultural waste because we want to eat the mushrooms. We don't want to grow them on trash and eat them. That's not good. But what if we're just growing them on all kinds of crazy trash to just build a house with it or do something that's not going to influence the water ground table or humans or anything like that, and off-gassing? That's a big question. So I was involved in a company for a couple of years looking into that. I'm no longer associated with, but that's a prospect that's pretty exciting. And certainly more people are going to come up with other ideas as time progresses. I mean, we're really at the beginning, I think, of a whole new era of human fungal relations, coming out of, the first big chapter being traditional approaches, the second chapter being sort of the codification of mycology as a science, the third chapter, really, I think, being the cultural sort of changes that came along with the psychedelic revolution and rethinking mushrooms in that way, sort of getting them popular in the counterculture, which did, good and bad, I think, for fungi, mushrooms generally. And then nowadays we're sort of entering this fourth era where we are sort of learning from all that past and looking forward into, great, broad, beautiful horizon.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different applications, right? I mean, one of the ones that seems very exciting is this remediation where, treating, as you say, kind of maybe brownfield sites or I think even oil spills. Like, can you speak to this kind of field?
Yeah, well, that's another. Yeah, absolutely. That's another one that I've spent quite a number of years unraveling. It's probably one of the other parts of my book that I'm most proud of. The chapter focused on that, which took an incredible amount of work to distill into something I think is fairly legible or readable for the novice. Which boils down to, in my thinking, several different ways that fungi can uniquely address pollution in the environment. And without trying to get too complex, maybe there's three, I guess. The one I just spoke of diverting waste streams, trash of all types, industrial waste streams of all sorts, grinding that up, feeding that to mushroom. Mycelium grows on it, turns it into a physical object that maybe has new, if not improved, qualities of the original trash waste stream. So that's sort of like remediation. It's not how I historically would have thought of it, but you are diverting waste via fungi and doing something so it doesn't pollute the world. So that's a good thing. More so historically, the way the research has looked is breaking down how fungi can address individual elements, especially heavy metals and things like arsenic, mercury, lead, cesium, uranium. And then we have complex molecules that fungi, so those elements fungi can't break down. Mercury will always be mercury. You can't turn it into gold or lead or something like that. That's an element. But fungi can move it around, do some manipulation with it in unique ways. And then there's molecules of all sizes and sorts. And fungi uniquely can break down and disassemble some of the compounds and pollutants that other organisms cannot. And so things that typically we think of persisting in the environment, for hundreds of years, fungi in the laboratory, under controlled conditions especially, can easily break down and disassemble those toxins, those pollutants, into either less toxic byproducts or completely inert byproducts. And so we have these two broad arenas of pollutants, and then we most commonly are concerned with them when they spill onto or into soils or into water systems. And so then we have sort of four categories is how I group this all in my mind. And what the listener can hopefully take away is that when you have heavy metals in soil, say from Fukushima or Chernobyl, big plume of cesium-rich cloud circles the planet, dust settles, and you have radioactive cesium settling on the surface of the soil and eventually incorporating into it, eventually getting taken up by mushrooms, and the deer eats that. The deer has radioactive cesium in it. It's still decaying. And then later the human eats that deer and eats radioactive deer meat and gets cancer. And so this is why Chernobyl still shut up. This is why they're still harvesting radioactive mushrooms up in Scandinavia, because this stuff is still slowly decaying. What can fungi do? Well, not a lot, unfortunately, just like pretty much everything else. They can take it up and accumulate that metal into their fruit body, their mushroom, but they can't break it down. They can't make their cesium stop being radioactive, but they concentrate it, which is nice. And just like many plants do this, if only we were to harvest that plant or mushroom, safely, dispose of it in a controlled environment, that's a way to sort of help get it out of the soil. But logistically, that's not really feasible. It's much more feasible with plants because they're easier to predict when and where they're going to grow, whereas mushrooms, they're much harder to, especially in the wild. So that's unfortunate. Basically, we just shouldn't be spilling heavy metals. We should leave them deep in the earth, probably. That's probably the better solution, or get our systems figured out. Conversely, when we spill heavy metals into water, which also shouldn't happen, but if it happens, when it happens, fungi offer something quite unique in that we can place their mycelium in the water, dead or alive, and the metals will naturally stick to the surface of the mycelium. It's a covalent, or it's called forming a complex is what it's called. And it's something like a magnet a magnetism is attracting there, without getting into the chemistry. And it's a natural function of the mycelium. So we can put the mycelium in there, water rushes by, metals stick to it. We pull the mycelium out. We can wash off that metal, recycle it, use it, make money off it maybe, and then put that same mycelium back in the water and do it all over again. There's lots of research looking at this application called bioabsorption, and it's every paper. It's just like, we need to be doing this. This is like economically feasible. It's almost better than current existing technologies, but it really hasn't been applied enough yet. And that's one of the aspects I'm actually really quite excited about and really encourage, because I think it's almost one of the easiest approaches to helping the environment via fungi. Because again, you can use dead mycelium, leftover mycelium from the mushroom farm that you have nothing else to do with, put it in your polluted river system. In soil systems, or with chemicals, you have the reverse. So when a chemical is spilled into water system, really the water is cold, has low oxygen dissolved into it. It might be salty. This is not an environment where mushroom mycelium that we are primarily looking at for this digestive ability lives. So we need to get the chemicals out of the water, really separate them out, and then try to treat them. The logistics of that, there are ways to do that, but it really becomes quite challenging. When you have an oil spill, you have the oil slick, and you can try to absorb that up with absorbent materials, get it onto land, warm it up so it's more hospitable to the mushroom, and then try to grow it on that. Throwing mycelium across the surface of a cold, oily lake is just not going to work. But you also have a lot of oil that sinks into the water column, and how do you get to capture that? So, we can do our best with spills and water, but again, we just shouldn't be spilling the stuff. I mean, it's just like, we can try our best, but really fungi can't just fix it. That's just the logistics of it, the biology of it, unfortunately. Conversely, we have, when we spill it into soils or solid materials, there it's more sort of stabilized so long as it doesn't wash into the river system or the water table. And there we can dig up that oily soil, say, pile it, maybe try to warm it up or do something to make it more hospitable, wet it down with some water, add some additional food like straw or something the mushroom can eat easily, and then grow it through that. And depending if it's the right species and chemical combination, best case scenario, it'll grow through that, digest that that pollutant and sort of clean up the soil, hopefully to safe levels. So to summarize, heavy metals in water, fungi can do some pretty interesting and unique, powerful stuff there. Chemicals in soil, they have strong potential there, but there's a lot of logistics there of digging up the stuff, creating a really perfect environment. If you have a beaten down sun, depending on the climate, it can be challenging, but there is potential there. So these are the two really great starting places that there's a lot of research in the lab for both of these things. Fungi breaking down all kinds of chemicals with great efficiency. Mycelium taking up heavy metals out of water, no problem, all kinds of heavy metals. The challenge nowadays is taking that out of the lab to the field. And you have a million variables, the environment, wild animals, pests working against you. The organism needs to be catered to if it's living while it's doing the work. There's bureaucracies, there's maintenance. And this is why industrial remediation is scrape and burn. Scrape up the soil, just burn it, and truck in some other soil from somewhere else. And so obviously it's not natural, it's not sustainable, but the reality of the logistics point towards this not really being, to some degree, and there have been companies that have developed sort of streamlined protocols for certain instances that are very doable, kind of getting at what I just described. But when we get into really complex spaces or really large environments, or some sort of tract of land, or indigenous piece of land that's been polluted more recently, or something like that, traditionally inhabited by indigenous peoples and this kind of thing, it kind of just boils down to becoming a grassroots effort, or some sort of community project, or nonprofit needs to be involved. We can't be turning towards government, we can't be turning towards industry to be accountable, to do the right, most natural thing. And so this is where my work started a long time ago with Radical Mycology. One of the first things I was more heavily evangelizing about was everybody should do microremediation, because that's the only way forward with it. We got to do it ourselves. And in as much as I still believe that, what I came to realize after a couple of years is like, well, that's like way too far ahead for most people. Most people don't even know what fungi are, let alone how to grow them, let alone how to like design a scientific experiment to like do this safely. But once we get over that learning curve, which is why I do what I do now, which is a lot of education-based stuff, soon enough we'll get to that point where culturally we can having these discussions more succinctly and more efficiently and with better design to evolve these protocols to make microremediation on impactful levels of reality.
Right. And do you think the current excitement in the mainstream around psilocybin mushrooms and psychiatry might be a kind of catalyst to get culture to that point where people are more engaged or interested in mushrooms?
For me, it's just two totally different topics. But I come from my way of thinking about fungi is different than most people's. I can imagine for a lot of people that again are totally novice and kind of uninformed about mycology broadly, they unlearn that mushrooms are bad because now psychology or psychiatry and other health fields are accepting these mushrooms as for all their unique benefits. As we talked about a little bit before, it's like helps flip the paradigm around, sort of open conversation up, which I would hope would lead towards talking about these other applications of mycology. I wouldn't want, again, mycology to just be pigeonholed to just being about psychedelics, and that's all that they're really good for. And that's kind of where they were stuck in the subculture for the last 70 50 whatever 50 70 years. You had a small number of people that knew about psychedelics and were so into them, not so much for the health benefits per se, but more just what they did to you. And then you had everybody else that were just like, they're super toxic, don't even touch them or look at them, child. And then you had a tiny number of people that were curious about their actual like taxonomy and classification. And that was pretty much it for the last, again, like 100 plus years. I would hate to see that all this potential that we're looking at for mycological transformation and mycocultural transformation and broadening on all these fronts be sort of, again, just all that energy shifted into like the psychedelic aspect of a very small number of mushrooms, and a tiny fraction of fungal species in the world are psychoactive. And for all the conversation to do it again, just go to that because, whoa, it's crazy what it does to me. I think would be a major loss. if it's a catalyst, if it starts the conversation, and all these other applications of mycology benefit and expand because we start there because of what people want right now, then so be it. Yeah, I would just hope the conversation is balanced as always.
Yeah. My hope would be, you know, a common aspect of these psychedelic experiences seems to be a shift towards more systems holistic thinking, and I feel like the kinds of things that the way of seeing the world through fungi, I feel like fits with the psychedelic experience quite nicely. So my hope might be that the more people are engaging with these things, and engaging with these states, the more they might see the wisdom in the fungal way of life, I guess. And so when it comes to kind of engaging with fungi through maybe foraging or cultivation, do you have any tips for people who, after listening to you, may be interested in getting started in this area?
Well, for foraging, usually the best place that I would always recommend folks go is their local mycological society. So that's where you're going to, meet the elders who know all the best spots. They're going to hand down, local lore and wisdom, local customs, local, recipes and stuff like that. I think that's really important to carry on those local traditions, and also to just understand what species are around you. You can get field guides from most parts of the Western world. In some parts outside the Western world, you might have a book dedicated to a whole country or a whole continent, but there's more and more every day, kind of thing, regional specific, state, territory, whatever you live in the world, specific field guides to the local mushrooms. So getting those books, but most importantly, really getting people that are experienced to pass on knowledge to you. If you don't have a local mycological society, there's more and more Facebook groups, especially that are dedicated to, local cities and states and provinces and whatnot. So finding that one that's in your, area or nearby, those are your safest, best first bets. Now beyond that, there's lots of places to, depending on the mushrooms you want to learn. Say if you just want to start with some really easy, popular edibles, there's ones that we call the foolproof fungi, or the foolproof 5. So those include chanterelles, shaggy mane, depending on who's writing the list, morels, chicken of the woods, giant puffballs. These are some of the more common ones that are thought to be essentially have no lookalikes whatsoever. Morels are a little bit debatable, but and then totally delicious, easy to find. And often produce in the same place year round. So you can look up those lists, the foolproof 5, foolproof fungi, and see if those ones occur in your area. Start there. That's really a DIY approach if you don't have anybody near you. And then if you want to go deeper, there's not really good books per se that really offer like a whole course, or like a real workbook through it. There's field guides, but you kind of have to learn to interpret them yourself. So the course that I've created through Mycologos, one of the ones that we currently offer, is on mushroom identification. And the first half of the course, we don't even talk about species. It's really just all the terms and tools and how to read the books and really how to think about doing this as a life skill. And, it's one thing to just rush out and find the foolproof 5. And, if the chanterelles grow by you, just go find them. That's great. They're bright and yellow and easy. But if you really want to wrap your head around all the nuances, kind of do it the best way, most efficient way, that's how my brain works, kind of really systems and just logical approach at times. So that's an approach I take through the training that I offer. And then we get into a bunch of species that are found in pretty much all temperate parts of the world, over 70 species and genera, as a good starting place. But even in that class, I definitely recommend, get the local field guides. You need them, but also join your local mycological society. So yeah, and that's as far as foraging goes. And then as far as cultivation goes, increasingly nowadays, there's so much support through Facebook groups, lots of YouTube stuff all the time. People teaching all kinds of stuff. It's not nearly as inaccessible as it was when I was growing up, which is great. And myself, I've taught mushroom cultivation for many years, traveling around many parts of the world, actually teaching cultivation. And it's one of the courses we'll be offering through Mycologos later in the year. Is kind of several levels, a total beginner introductory one, as well as one that's quite advanced. Behind this wall is my organic mushroom farm. So I actually run a fully functional mushroom farm. So we'll have one that's more on that level, with a lot of the details sort of dialed in there. If, just going through the stuff on YouTube, which is great, is a little bit sort of too much. I'm going to provide my own codified sort of protocols and whatnot to keep it more streamlined. But Facebook groups, there's a couple great forums. Shroomery and Mycotopia are legendary. That I learned a lot there a long time ago. If you have the time to sift through and just read lots of stuff and sort of scroll and troll, there's tons to be gleaned. The internet's been a blessing for mycology and especially mushroom cultivation. Everybody loves sharing their ideas and insights.
Right. And is your website for Mycologos, is that where you'd send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Yeah, so that's the main functional website right now where all my effort is going towards. So mycologos.world. We've been working, for many months, and there's just been sort of delays, but we're going to be launching a whole new thing pretty soon. I keep saying that, but it's getting closer and closer all the time. But folks can look at it now. But just what I keep saying is, join our email list. There's just so much that's sort of been building up in the works. That's as soon as possible, we're going to be pulling the trigger and launching all kinds of really new big stuff. So join the email list, follow us on social media to keep up with some really cool stuff coming down the pipe. But we have some classes available right now at Mycologos. And then my work with Radical Mycology, that's always been more of a labor of love. So my book is available, and you can find that through any number of online venues. If you go to radicalmycology.com, that's a placeholder website right now, as the work there has sort of been on pause, largely due to COVID and some things that have kind of gotten in the way, slowed things that were in the plans there down. But you can also go to radicalmycologyconvergence.com, and we haven't updated the site yet, but probably the next couple of months we'll be updating it for the convergence this fall, which will be happening in Oregon if folks are able to make it out here. And that'll be pretty awesome. We haven't had one for 4 years, which is pretty crazy to me. And we have lots in the works for that. Excuse me. So that should be keep me pretty busy for the year as well. So yeah.
Great. Yeah. And thanks so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Same. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.